Good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to this webinar on the war waged against Tigrayan women, organized by Lord Alton of Liverpool, the Coalition for Genocide Response, and the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Eritrea. My name is Ewelina Ohab, and I'm the co-founder of the Coalition for Genocide Response. I'm joined by my colleague Jess Templeman and a panel of experts that I will introduce shortly. Our problem is with your womb. Your womb gives birth to a Woyane. A Tigrayan womb should never give birth. A Tigrayan woman was told after she was gang raped and mutilated. Hers is one of many similar reports emerging daily from Tigray. At the end of January 2021, the UN Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflict, Pramila Patten, reported on serious allegations of sexual violence in the Tigray region of Ethiopia, including a high number of alleged rapes in the capital, Mekelle. As the UN Special Representative said, there are disturbing reports of individuals allegedly forced to rape members of their own family and the threat of imminent violence. Some women have been reportedly forced by military elements to have sex in exchange for basic commodities, while medical centers have indicated an increase in the demand for emergency contraceptions and testing for sexually transmitted diseases, which is often an indicator of sexual violence in conflict. In addition, there are increasing reports of sexual violence against women and girls in a number of refugee camps. These allegations require urgent investigation and accountability. The UN Special Representative called upon the parties involved in Tigray region hostilities to commit to a zero tolerance policy for crimes of sexual violence. She further called on the government of Ethiopia to exercise its due diligence obligation to protect all civilians from sexual and other violence, regardless of their ethnic origin, and those displaced by conflict, and to promptly allow for an independent inquiry into all allegations of sexual violence and other forms of violence, to establish the facts and hold perpetrators accountable, provide redress for victims, and prevent further grave violations. Report after report suggests that rape and sexual violence against Tigrayan women are a commonly used weapon of war and might even reach the threshold of a genocidal act. Today, the panelists will discuss the situation of Tigrayan women, consider the nature of the atrocities and the needed responses. And we'll hear from Lord Alton of Liverpool, Crossbench peer at the UK House of Lords, patron of the Coalition for Genocide Response, and officer with the APPG on Eritrea. Professor Mukesh Kapila, CBE, Professor Emeritus, Global Health and Humanitarian Affairs, University of Manchester. Lucy Kassa, a journalist reporting on the situation in Tigray and author of recent report with Al Jazeera on the use of rape and sexual violence in Tigray. Sally Kibble, former MP and Minister in the Department for International Development, founding CEO of the Anglican Alliance, the Global Development Agency for Anglicans, and His Eminence Archbishop Angelos, Coptic Orthodox Archbishop of London and Director of RUSEMI. If you'd like to ask any questions, please use the Q&A function. And now, without any further ado, I would like to give the floor to Lord Alton of Liverpool.
Thank you. I'd like to begin by thanking Dr. Ohab, the Coalition for Genocide Response, and the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Eritrea, which I co-chair, for bringing us together for today's webinar. It's a privilege to speak alongside some of our distinguished contributors, but I can't say it's a pleasure to have to return to issues which were raised in an earlier webinar on March the 16th, and which I've been raising as an issue in parliamentary questions and in letters to the government since before the Ethiopian troops began their assault on Tigray last November. And that, of course, in turn paved the way for incursions by Eritrean militias with devastating and catastrophic consequences. Not only have premeditated war crimes, which had been predicted, had appalling outcomes for the people of the region, it's been an unmitigated failure for the international community, with the United Nations Security Council exposed yet again as utterly compromised by authoritarian regimes, ruthlessly vetoing any attempts to prevent, to protect or punish, and doing so to ingratiate themselves with the perpetrators. And simultaneously, of course, the feeble rhetoric of impotent liberal democracies has also thus far exposed our international mechanisms as being pretty worthless. Reports over the last few days demonstrate the scale and the intensity of this man-made horror story. And we'll hear later from Professor Mukesh Kapila, who was reported on Saturday as saying that genocide is being committed in Tigray. 18 years ago, he and I both warned of an unfolding genocide in Darfur. Alex Duval, one of the foremost international experts on the Horn of Africa, says of Tigray, his words, "It's certainly a lot worse than Darfur." Last week, it was reported that the head of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, Abune Matthias, an ethnic Tigrayan, had been placed in detention with fears for his safety after he said that the atrocities constitute a genocide. His words, "They want to destroy the people of Tigray. I'm not clear why they want to declare genocide on the people of Tigray. It's not the fault of the Tigray people. The whole world should know it." He said many barbarisms have been conducted all over Ethiopia. What is happening in Tigray is of the highest brutality and cruelty. This came at the same time as a report of the killing of almost 80 Orthodox priests. On May the 14th, the Africa Minister in the UK, James Duddridge, told me in a letter that Ethiopia must, his words, allow for urgent and unimpeded access to human rights investigators. These matters must be brought before competent national and international courts. But he knows that there is no domestic or international mechanism that will enable that to happen. And so the words just become posturing, striking a meaningless pose, and telling me that he had held a conversation with the Ethiopian ambassador on February the 24th, I repeat, February the 24th, nearly 3 months ago, while appalling reports emerged from Tigray of atrocity crimes, hardly suggests any sense of urgency. With Dr. Ohad, the Coalition for Genocide Response is keeping a carefully documented account of correspondence and questions which list the failure of the United Kingdom and other states to respond and to honour their legal obligations under the 1948 Convention on the Crime of Genocide. And then, of course, as for the African Union, with its headquarters in Addis Ababa, and with the chairman of its African Union Commission saying in December last that Ethiopia had taken, his word, legitimate military action in Tigray, well, the African Union has hardly distinguished itself either. While the international community has either aided and abetted these atrocities or dithered and delayed, we've seen shocking reports of massacres, hundreds of killings and mass graves, ethnic cleansing, targeted murders, starvation being used as a weapon of war, and a systematic campaign of rape, with one report in The Guardian last week describing the rape of a little girl aged 8, with bodies being eaten by hyenas. It's to highlight the specific assault on girls and women which prompted me, after seeing a report on Al Jazeera, to suggest that this further webinar should be held. In that report, it was said that chillingly, a Tigrayan woman was, and we've heard this quote, "Our problem is with your womb." She said, "Your womb gives birth to Woyane," a derogatory term. A Tigrayan womb should never give birth. Tragically, this isn't an isolated case. Rape and sexual violence against women is being relentlessly used as a weapon of war against the women and girls of Tigray. And as we discuss such crimes, we need to consider what it means in terms of our duties, in terms of genocidal methods. Rape and sexual violence would fall, in terms of the convention, within Article 2B, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, and D, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. Of course, the occurrence of such atrocities does not necessarily make them genocide. In order to classify as genocide, the atrocities have to be shown to have been committed against a protected group and with the specific intent to destroy the group in whole or in part. But Tigrayans are an ethnic minority, and as such, a protected group under the Genocide Convention. The question then is whether we can identify the specific intent to destroy the group in whole or in part. Such specific intent can be direct or inferred from the atrocities that I've mentioned. As the courageous Lucy Kassa, whom we'll hear from later, who has herself been subject to threats and intimidation, as Lucy reported in the remark that we've referred to, Akbaret, a woman that she interviewed to her, said, and I repeat, I begged them to stop. I asked them, crying, why they were doing that to me. What wrong have I done to you? It was then that those infamous and incriminating words were used. I repeat them. Akbaret said, you did nothing bad to us. Our problem is with your womb. Your womb gives birth to Woyane. It's a derogatory term which is used to refer to the TPLF. A Tigrayan womb, she was told, should never give birth. Such statements make clear the specific intent to destroy a group of people. Of course, more evidence may well be needed, which is why the perpetrators have prohibited access and are doing their best to destroy evidence and eliminate potential witnesses, and indeed to intimidate those collecting evidence, including journalists. But even with what we know already, the specific intent can be inferred from the atrocities themselves, atrocities that we have seen and heard of over these recent months. Apart from targeting of people because of their ethnicity, there's also evidence that the atrocities are being targeted at religious groups, and we will hear later from His Grace Archbishop Angelos. But in January 2021, it was reported that Tigray's Church of Our Lady, Mary of Zion in Aksum was the scene of a massacre of 750 people. And a week ago, Lucy reported that over the last 5 months, according to a letter addressed to the Synod of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, at least 78 priests were killed in one zone of Tigray. Now, having myself visited Darfur and the genocide sites in Rwanda, along with first-hand visits to affected groups in northern Iraq and Burma, and after taking witness statements and accounts from genocide-affected minorities such as Yazidis and Uyghurs, I know well enough that states and the international community will not respond to the atrocities unless we call for action again and again and again, which is why we must increase the volume of our voices. And here I pay tribute to Sally Keeble, and who we'll hear from as well later on, for what she has been doing to keep focus on Tigray. Let me conclude. This morning I posted an account by Professor Janison of Ghent University. In it, he reports from Mekelle that, I quote, numerous women have been raped. The victims hide themselves and do not speak, but nurses cannot hold their tears, and their whole town knows the top 3 of the rapists. 1, and by far, Eritrean soldiers. 2, Ethiopian soldiers. 3, civilian perpetrators. On Saturday, Helen Clark, the former Prime Minister of New Zealand, said this: there is evidence of ethnic cleansing in Western Tigray. If carried out with the intent of eliminating Tigrayans, it may be classified as genocide. Taken altogether, the serious crimes being committed against Tigrayans, including massacres of civilians of all ages, may meet the definition of genocide. I agree. In the face of these reports and these statements, I appeal to Dominic Raab to urgently table the UN resolution to the Security Council, regardless of threats by China or Russia to veto it, and to expose those who are attempting to conceal the scale and the gravity of what is underway in Tigray, and to ensure that a judicial mechanism is created, independent if necessary of the United Nations, so that one day, as in Bosnia, as in Darfur, however long it takes, those responsible are brought to justice. We owe it to all the people of Tigray, and especially to the women and girls who've been so egregiously violated, to ensure that atrocity is not the last word, and impunity is not the order of the day.
Thank you very much, Lord Alton. And now I would like to give the floor to Professor Mukesh Kapila.
I've been reflecting on this and trying to compare what I'm hearing about what's going on in Tigray with my historical experiences in the genocides where I've had a ringside seat. And that is in Darfur, that is in Rwanda, and that is in Srebrenica, because my career, unfortunately, has taken me to those places when I've been working for the Department for International Development as was. And before that, the Overseas Development Administration, which is now the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, how history comes around. Anyway, and I was thinking about this, and what I learned from my travels around genocide hotspots, if I can put it that way, is that every genocide has a signature. While all the genocide acts that we know of, the use of famine, sexual violence, and massacres, have been seen in many genocides. What happens is, if you look at those genocides, you will see that one or other acts tends to dominate. So, for example, the signature mark of the Rwanda genocide was mass massacres. Sexual violence also took place in Rwanda, but it was a concomitant act. So when I was the head of the United Nations in Sudan dealing with Darfur, and Darfur happened on my patch, so to speak, the signature mark of that particular genocide was the large-scale destruction of livelihoods of the people of the arid region of Darfur, which meant that they were literally ethnically cleansed away. And of course, a lot of sexual violence took place. Maybe a third of the population, third of the women there were raped, some estimates. But again, that was a concomitant act. What has struck me in the case of Tigray, in looking at the data, and I'm a professor of global health, and epidemiology is a part of my toolkit, is a number of things become clear. One is that the reports that are coming out of Tigray are far too consistent. They are far too similar. They're far too following a pattern. And as we've discovered, when you study a new condition like the coronavirus, you decide what causes a problem by looking at the pattern of what goes on. So I'm totally convinced that when history is written in terms of the conflict in Tigray and Ethiopia, people will say that the signature mark of this particular genocide, and of that there is no doubt it is a genocide in the opinion of many people, the signature mark of that is going to be sexual violence. Now, the other thing that strikes me about this is that normally during historic genocides, other forms of violence happen, and then the sexual violence becomes more prominent or is reported in a prominent manner. What has struck me is that if you track back on the last few months in Tigray, the reports of sexual violence have actually accompanied the earliest days of the horrific events that have been taking place in the country, in the territory, in the region. Now, to me, that points towards a strategy, that points towards an organization, and that points towards a deliberate planning of a campaign. Now, it is for others to judge perhaps who is responsible in terms of command and control, but obviously there is command and control. If you again look into military history and you look into wars and you look into sexual violence in wars, which has happened through all of history, what you realize is that ordinary soldiers, of course, they commit these crimes, and especially if they're ill-disciplined, they will commit these crimes. But generally speaking, crimes of this magnitude don't happen unless there is command and control, if only from field commanders. Now, the question in our determination is whether the organized, strategically directed sexual violence, rape, and the physical violence that has accompanied the rape is a tactical level decision, or whether it is a higher level command and control decision. And again, history comes to enlighten us is that if you look back into similar genocides or into genocides in other situations, Srebrenica, for example, with which I'm familiar too, having been in the British government at that time with repeated visits to the former Yugoslavia. It's very, very clear that actually tactical commanders are very conscious of international humanitarian law, and they don't risk putting their head above the parapet in doing this unless they're commanded by higher level officers. This is why I am concluding that the signature tune, if you like, of the situation in Tigray, which is that of sexual violence, is also telling us that this tune is being played by someone higher up. And it is part of an attempt to intimidate. It is part of an attempt to try and get an early victory, which of course they failed in. Because that's the other thing we have learned from other such situations. Because, and certainly this is a lesson I learned as the UN head in Sudan, because the governments are very often find it very difficult to find military solutions to insurgency, and they find it very difficult to have a quick win, which is, of course, what the Ethiopian government also promises in the early days of Tigray. The cheap and easy way to get a victory is to carry out these kinds of coercions, these kinds of intimidation. And as you know, while sexual violence is very common everywhere, and here let me digress a little bit to say that I've looked at some of the data on sexual violence in Ethiopia, probably, and surveys indicate that even before this whole business, probably 1 in 3 women had experienced sexual violence. And this is, I'm talking about the whole of Ethiopia. And this is, by the way, an average figure compared for all of Africa. Now, but when you are in a neighborhood where on one hand you have Sudan, where we've had a genocide there, and you have got Somalia on the other side, violence, especially atrocities of this nature, including sexual atrocities, they have some kind of infective properties. When you live in a bad neighborhood, you kind of do bad things because you've learned from other people in the neighborhood. And these connections, if you wish, are part of the contextual evidence and part of the bigger picture that is quite important in order to actually make the case of why the form of sexual violence that we're seeing in Tigray is not just the ordinary sexual violence that you see in any unruly conflict. It is a deliberate part of a campaign, of a strategy. It's premeditated. One further bit of evidence, if I can put it that way, and that is that when women affected by sexual violence have sought help, there has been obstruction to that help being provided. And generally speaking, we know from experience of obstruction to aid and help, and from all my sins, I have unfortunately spent most of my life in those kinds of situations. Usually, the purpose of an obstruction to assistance, whether it's medical assistance in this case or humanitarian assistance more generally, is because it is a means to actually perpetuate the original harm that has taken place in order to complete the original act. And as we know, the genocidal acts, the purpose behind that is elimination. Of course, we know that the elimination will not happen entirely, but the intention is very much through obstruction and even disallowing humanitarian assistance to go through, and let alone medical assistance to happen. It actually provides very strong collateral evidence. And we know that obstruction is provided by the same troops that actually committed the atrocities in the first place. So for me, putting all those pieces together, you don't have to be very clever to figure out that what is going on there are qualifying acts of genocide. Now, the difference between genocidal acts and genocide, when genocidal acts take place, for example, whether it is food deprivation or mass rape or mass slaughters, those are individual genocidal acts. But when they take place in juxtaposition to each other and they are in synergy to each other, then the whole context is maybe considered a genocide. You know, now the whole of Tigray is a crime scene, essentially speaking. That's what it is. Final postscript on the Genocide Convention, and I hope we will have some discussion on what to do about all this in terms of the next steps. One thing we see in terms of Genocide Convention of the post-Holocaust 1940s is that genocide, an appreciation of the law has advanced. So yes, the original convention talks a great deal about using the word genocide in relation to proven intent. But then if you look at the provisions of various other conventions that have come along, including that of the International Criminal Court most recently, or various African conventions, or in Latin America, you realize that in order to bring about individual accountability and to say person X is responsible, obviously you have to prove their direct hand in that. As for example, is what has happened in the case of former President al-Bashir of Sudan, who is now indicted for acts of genocide in Darfur. However, the difficult requirement to prove intent in the case of individual commanders or leaders or heads of government or heads of state should not distract away from a determination of the actual situation. So think about this. For example, you know, if somebody is murdered out in the street and we don't know who committed the murder, that doesn't stop the definition to be made that a person has been murdered on the street. Similarly, it may be a long legal cry to say that someone committed genocide, but that doesn't stop us from saying that a genocide has been committed. So in that context, I think it's extremely important that we understand that sexual violence in the case of Tigray is a defining signature feature of this particular context. And it is urgent, and it needs to be addressed by all the means that we have available, and ultimately legally. And because these are crimes of universal jurisdiction, we should not be hindered by either the International Criminal Court, nobody having complained to the International Criminal Court, or any other such, any country in the world can actually bring a case against the perpetrators in Tigray in any other court in the world, if necessary. Let me stop there.
Thank you very much, Professor Kapila. And now I would like to give the floor to Lucy Kassa.
Thank you so much for inviting me to this event. So it has been 6 months now since the conflict in Tigray began. Throughout this month, civilians in the region were subjected to gross human rights violation, atrocities, and horrific sexual violence in the hands of Ethiopian soldiers, militias from neighboring region Amhara, and the Eritrean troops. Since early December last year, I've been interviewing many women who are victims of gang rape and sexual slavery. Just a week, the Eritrean troops took control of Shire in November, a city in western Tigray. They used to stop any woman they found, irrespective of age, and gang rape them in public. After raping them, they leave them in the street, and no passerby was allowed to help this woman. A survivor from this gang rapes told me she's relieved the soldiers only gang raped her for a few hours because she knew many women who were subjected to unimaginable torture and sexual slavery for weeks. This woman's brother and cousin were brutally slaughtered in the Maikadra massacre by the Amharas, and later the Ethiopian soldiers killed her second brother while they were fleeing to the capital, Ma'ala. I always remember what this woman said to me in tears. when pain is too much, you learn to bear it anyways, was what she says to me. I have talked to a 55-year-old mother who was gang raped together with her 40-year-old girl in front of her husband. I know a husband who was asked to pay 5,000 in order to free his abducted wife from Ethiopian soldiers who were gang raping her for weeks. I know a pregnant woman who has miscarriage after being raped and brutally beaten by Ethiopian soldiers. But the victims always tell me the soldiers can do whatever they like. Not only tortured, girls in Tigray have been killed by their abusers after they were raped. As you can read in my latest article, the Amhara militias have inserted a hot metal rod into the genitals of a woman and told her Tigrayan women should never give birth. These stories are just the tip of the iceberg, and indeed the stories of many women in Tigray. Testimonies I obtained indicate rape is being used as a weapon of war. Ethiopian, Eritrean, and Amhara forces are using rape to terrorize and demoralize the people of Tigray. Apart from the atrocities and extrajudicial killings they're carrying out, they're using rape as one form of ethnic cleansing. Many women are impregnated after being raped. There are also cases of castration with a clear aim of preventing Tigrayan women from giving birth. HIV-infected Eritrean soldiers are deliberately sent to Tigray to infect as many women as they can. These soldiers took post-exposure HIV drugs from my source and told her they want to make her HIV positive. Apart from the physical trauma, I know women who developed serious mental illness because of the brutality. Soldiers who gang raped some of the victims I talked already confessed to the victims while raping them that the gang rape is an order from their superiors. We are told to rape the women and massacre the men. You have oppressed us for 27 years and we will make you cry a blood for 100 years, is what some of the abusers in the Ethiopian National Army told my interviewee. Before Ethiopian soldiers raped 2 university students in Mekelle on February 28, the first thing they asked the students was if they are Tigrayans or not. When the head of the university tries to bring these abusers to justice, he received harassment and threats from the government. It wasn't the criminals, but rather him who got punished for trying to stop the war criminals. This all indicates that there's a systemic project of exterminating and cleansing ethnic Tigrayans using rape. Addressing the horrific sexual violence, the Prime Minister said in March, their women were just raped by men, but our soldiers were violated with bayonets. By saying this, not only did he try to justify and simplify the sexual violence on Tigray women, but also he treated the Tigrayan women as if they are no longer Ethiopians. He said theirs. For long, the Ethiopian government has been denying these cases as politically motivated false allegations. It was actively engaged in repressing the coming out of these stories, not in holding the abusers into account. It wasn't until the publication of Merhawit's story in LA Times, the Ministry of Women admitted this is not because the government wasn't aware of the war crimes. I myself was attacked in February 8 by government agents just for bringing these stories to light. I was threatened to days and forced to flee my home country just because I reported about a woman who was subjected to brutal gang rape by Eritrean soldiers. At this time, while we are having this event, many Tigrayan women are undergoing sexual violence. Hospitals are receiving new cases on a daily basis. Most of the victims are unable to get medical help because hospitals are looted and destroyed. The Eritrean troops are still gang raping and torturing women in Tigray in a graver way, despite both government's statement to withdraw the troops. The Ethiopian army soldiers and the Amhara militias have also continued to rape and inflict the most horrible pain on Tigrayan women. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Lucy. Thank you very much for sharing those powerful reportings with us. And thank you, of course, for reporting on the situation in Tigray. Your reporting have been heartbreaking, of course, but ultimately they help to show the real picture of the situation in Tigray and the situation of women in Tigray, which we very much appreciate what you've been doing for in this reporting. So thank you very much for that. And now I would like to give the floor to Sally Kibble.
Thank you very much for that. And I want to start by just paying a really special tribute to Lucy Kassa for what you've done. Both your work in reporting in what's been happening in Tigray and your immense courage actually in speaking today as well, given the pressures that you've been under. Because it's, you have done something really unique in bringing out the stories of sexual violence. It was your reporting that gave the title to this webinar. And it's also your reporting that has given some of the clearest evidence of what's happening in Tigray is in fact sexual violence as genocide. And when the story of all of this is written, I'm absolutely sure it's your reporting and the stories which you brought out, which will have given a lot of the hard evidence for whatever happened. And I want to look at some of the next steps. So, thank you very much and huge respect to Lucy.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
I also want to thank the coalition and Lord David Alton and Dr. Ochab for organising this webinar, because at a time when a lot of eyes are on other parts of the world, it's very important that the advocacy continues for Tigray. And it's also very appropriate this webinar is being hosted from London, as the government here has a particular responsibility for dealing with what's happening and the sexual violence. The comments I make are taken from a chapter for a book, for a publication on the conflict, which is coming out in June, due to come out in June, being published by Eritrea Focus. And just to put a few numbers on it, the number of survivors of rape in Tigray were conservatively estimated in March to be 10,000. And these aren't isolated incidents. These are part, as Professor Kapila has said, these are part of a systematic campaign which is linked to the massacres. And so often we've seen reports coming out of Tigray saying they killed the men, they raped the women. That's not to say that the military haven't also been killing the women too, because the pictures show that. And just to assist, I've prepared a few slides. So hopefully, if this works, and I'm not too unadept at it, they will come up and you should be able to see them. First of all, just as a reminder of what constitutes genocide, and I've taken this from the UN definition. I'm sure that most people here are probably very, very familiar with it, but just in case you're not, here it is. Shall I try and move that over there? There's a mental element with the intent to destroy in whole or in part. And that's something that often doesn't get overlooked, because I think, as Professor Kapila said, very often people think of like the Rwanda genocide and the wholesale massacres. It's whole or in part. So a defence by the government saying that it didn't intend to massacre all of them actually isn't a defence. And the next thing is in the physical element, that you don't have to kill people to destroy them. The definition includes serious bodily and mental harm. And as Lucy said, there's very clear evidence about the appalling impact on mental health of women being raped. And as she also pointed out, there's the imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and the mutilation that's taken place, I think very clearly covers that aspect as well. Now, Lucy's reporting has documented the sexual violence, and she's also spoken on it very movingly today. The women who've come forward and given their testimonies have been very brave, and they've also had to revisit their traumas in order to do so. And I think our job here isn't to keep on repeating their stories, but to make sure that action is taken on what's happened, and that those women get justice. So in the next slide, I've set out only some very general characteristics of what's been happening, and I completely agree with what Professor Kapila has said, that very sadly, sexual violence is going to appear to be one of the hallmarks of this genocide. At the bottom, you can see very clearly the specific reference to rape being used to purify or cleanse women, the clearest linkage of it to genocide, to intent. We have Lucy's quote, which she's repeated, about a Tigrayan woman should never give birth. And also here at the bottom, claim to be Amhara and will give you back your house and find you a husband. If you claim to be Tigrayan, we will come and rape you again. That was in a report that came out very recently. And just a point about the ages of women, I received a report this morning which came detailing 31 survivors of sexual violence in Mekelle. Of those 31, 14 of them were aged under 16-year-olds, or 16 or under, and 4 of them were 12 or under. So that is a measure of the appalling targeting of women and very young girls. And if I could be allowed just a very short deviation, the report also set out some of appalling information about the impact of conflict on people with disabilities. Wheelchair users having their wheelchairs taken away by the military, so they've been forced to crawl, and also being deliberately left in buildings when those buildings have been set on fire. People with disabilities are very often a group who get overlooked in the international discourse, and they also deserve special protection. The next slide just sets out the Fourth Geneva Convention, the bit in the Fourth Geneva Convention, Article 4, that sets out the broad principle of that women should be especially protected against any attack on their honour, in particular rape. And it covers internal as well as international conflict. So for a government to say this is a local difficulty, again, isn't a defence. It's a world's business, what is happening to women in Tigray. And the UN Security Council has passed 5 resolutions prohibiting sexual violence in conflict. In the next slide, I point to just 2 of them. And the language could not be clearer or more unequivocal. Sexual violence in conflict isn't allowed. Impunity must be ended. Perpetrators should be prosecuted. There should be command responsibility in the prosecutions. They should be excluded from amnesties, these crimes, and also that it can be a constitutive act of genocide, as previous speakers have said. And there have been plenty of people sounding the alarm. Pramila Patten, obviously, Michelle Bachelet, head of UNHCR, and Helen Clark, former head of UNDP. And the issue seems to be not so much whether sexual violence is happening and whether it's genocidal in intent, which I think everybody who's spoken so far has said there's very clear evidence. Not that the international community isn't completely opposed to this happening. The issue is what's going to happen. And that's where the UK comes in, because the UK government put itself very much at the forefront of international efforts to stop sexual violence in conflict with the launch of its initiative in 2012. The UK made it a feature of its presidency of the G8 in 2013, and then again came back to the issue with the publication of its international protocol on the documentation and investigation of sexual violence and conflict in 2014, updated in 2017. And it's a very good protocol indeed. I've put out just a few points of it in the next slide, which say how sexual violence and conflict can be treated as a war crime, as a crime against humanity, and as a genocide. And I would argue that the evidence that we've heard today and that has been coming forward time and again in the past 6 months is that it should be treated as sexual violence, as genocide. And in fact, just last year, the protocol, it's an extraordinary document and it draws on a lot of international expertise. It sets out how sexual violence can be treated as a war crime. And it also says what options are open where national governments won't act. And the Ethiopian government has said it will take action, but there's no sign of that yet. So the UK protocol says the international community can act by setting up a commission of inquiry, an international or hybrid tribunal, or referring the situation to the ICC. And just last year, the UK government was again talking about its campaign against sexual violence and conflict. And my next slide, and it's my last one, shows what the UK said in June 2020. This was the Prime Minister's Special Representative for Preventing Sexual Violence and Conflict, which that's UK Prime Ministers, that we're determined to tackle this crime and that the UK remains committed to take action. So committed to take action and action to hold perpetrators to account. And then unfortunately, when we get to what's been going on in Tigray, we have the Africa Minister saying last month in evidence to the Select Committee that this is what people are saying is happening, that's sexual violence is genocide. There are verbal accounts, but getting solid evidence is tricky. Well, I don't think that actually getting solid evidence is so tricky. Lucy has provided a very large amount through her reporting, and the survivors of these crimes are also there, who are able to give evidence, as indeed are their doctors. And some of the doctors and nurses who've been treating these women have been very brave and bold in calling out what's been happening. So the issue then is what to do. The UK's protocol makes clear what should happen. Our Foreign Secretary will be well aware of these from his previous professional involvement as a human rights lawyer. And I believe that the UK must step up to its responsibility, because there's no point launching a campaign in the abstract and then not seeing it through in reality. That only adds to the despair of the survivors. And also, importantly, shifts the burden of tackling this crime from a powerful government like the UK with its seat on the Security Council onto the survivors and their advocates. Now, the UN's International Day for the Elimination of Sexual Violence in Conflict is coming up. It's on June the 19th. And that should be the day that the UN takes its first steps towards setting up a tribunal to investigate the sexual violence as genocide in Tigray, and the start of justice for the survivors. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sally. And now I would like to give the floor to Archbishop Angelos. Sayedna, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Ohab. If I may ask the chair, we've heard so much, and we, I think, have been moved beyond words. If we can just take a moment of silence to focus on what Lucy has told us. If you're a person of prayer, then please pray for these women we've been hearing about. And if you're not, just think about the incredible violations that we've been listening to. Thank you once again, Evelina. I'm very thankful to the Coalition for Genocide Response, for Lord David Alton, Professor Kapila, Ms. Keeble, and above all, Lucy, for all the insight that we've had today. I think that we could not all have spoken and just heard these harrowing accounts to realize what people are going through on a daily basis. When we had a similar online event only weeks ago, I remember there was a lot of chatter, and some of it not very kind, on social media afterwards, telling us that we should not speak for Ethiopian people, telling us that we had no credible sources, and asking where we got our information. Since then, and although at that time I had spoken to many of our Ethiopian sisters and brothers and had received all the information from them directly, since then, the Patriarch of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church has spoken out. His Holiness, the Patriarch, has sent out a message to the world on video, and I've got the transcript. Abuna Matthäus says that women are being raped and they are in pain. And this is an incredibly moving sentence that follows. He says, "Those men who died are luckier than these women who are suffering. The trauma in the minds of these women is difficult to remove." We know that when we've seen incidents of sexual violence in conflict, in war, acts of this kind of terror, we know that sexuality is used as a weapon. And I remember very, very clearly at the launch of the PSVI initiative in Lancaster House some years ago, when the Cardinal of Westminster, Cardinal Vincent Nichols, stood and he said how painful and wrong it was that a gift of God that was given for life was used as a weapon to inflict pain and death. And that is precisely what we are seeing. We are seeing the most sacred gift of life, that of procreation, that symbol of oneness between man and woman, being taken and weaponized, being taken and used to subdue and subject people to incredible shame and suffering, women and men alike. We've heard of massacres of hundreds of people. We've heard of a massacre of 78 priests that Lord Alton had mentioned earlier. Starvation and deprivation of humanitarian aid. And of course, this sexual violence. I must make a public confession here, and that is that during our Holy Week and the lead up to Easter, the Feast of the Resurrection, we have a group of litanies that we pray, petitions to God. And one of them specifically asks for protection for women. And I had been in England for 15 or 20 years and thought, this sounds incredibly sexist. Why are we just asking for protection for women? This will be derogatory. Women will think they are weak. But in actual fact, this prayer that was written hundreds of years ago speaks to a truth that remains until today. It is not because of the weakness of women that we pray for them. It is because of the incredible gift they carry in themselves, in their own creation, that God has given them, that we pray for their protection. Because this gift also becomes their vulnerability. This gift becomes that one weapon that is used against them and through them to subjugate them and their families. Abuna Matthias goes on to say that monks have been displaced. They've lost their lives. Elderly monks and the sick are left on the wayside. I've just received a report today of the intentional starvation of 7 monks. And he goes on to say these types of atrocities have never been seen so far, particularly the rape of women is disgraceful. And it goes to the core of their human dignity. For those who ask why we speak, it is because we speak to the dignity and sanctity of life, whether of men or women, whether in Tigray or anywhere else in the world. And I ask our sisters and brothers listening, whether now or later, to not just resort to political rhetoric, to not just be dismissive, to not just reject accounts as harrowing as we have heard from Lucy and others. And as I said last time, if these are untrue, then I pray to God you are right. I pray to God this is a mass social media campaign, the likes of which we have not seen before, an incredible decoy, something that is absolute fake and a deep fake at that. I pray that is the truth. But all the indications we have is that it is not. As we heard from Professor Kapila, there is a consistency in the accounts. There is a consistency in what we are hearing and what we are seeing. And I pray, along with all of you, that today, that we can look beyond tribes, nationalities, ethnicities, color of skin, faith, dogma, and we look beyond and below the skin and the ethnicity and look at the human integrity, sacredness that is within us all. These women are our sisters, our mothers, our daughters. We cannot stay silent. We do not mean any offense to anyone by this. We do not mean political gain. We are responding to the call of a father in the patriarch for his children, particularly for his daughters, who are beloved by God, created by God, but for whom now we are called to be a voice and advocates. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sayedna, for a powerful presentation. And unfortunately, it's already 5 o'clock, so it means that we won't have time for questions and answers. However, I will just use 1 or maximum 2 minutes just to conclude. First of all, a big kudos to all our speakers for the powerful presentations and for the work on the topic that is not receiving enough attention. A big kudos to all attendees for raising important questions as well. And if you'd like to send some of the questions, we'll try to answer them in due course as well. So please be in touch and send over the questions. We'll try to respond to them. And of course, it's not only about talking and discussing what is happening in Tigray, discussing the situation of women and girls. We are all about action. And among others, we'll be raising those issues directly with the Prime Minister, including we'll be sending a letter to the Prime Minister about the murder of the 78 religious leaders, as recently reported by Lucy, and we'll be raising the issue of rape and sexual violence as well. So please stay in touch, and we'll be making sure that we follow up all the discussions that we had today with action. So thank you very much and have a good day.